So a quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Wabagal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides, and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, Ian Berger, is a PhD candidate here in ancient history and is a professional archaeologist and heritage specialist at Transport for New South Wales, where he is involved in the conservation and adaptation of historic road, rail and marine infrastructure. He is also a member of the Sydney Ancients reenactment group involved with public education and displays using reconstructions of ancient Greek arms and armour. And if you've ever seen one of their displays, I can say it is very impressive. He brings these interests together in his doctoral research, which focuses on the Battle of Marathon and the mobility of the heavily armed and armoured Athenian and Plataean forces involved in the engagement, particularly their ability to run over extended distances, as described by new contemporary historical sources. His paper today stems from this research and is titled "In the Footsteps of Miltiades at Marathon 490 BC, Odyssey Travelling Scholarship Report." Ian, over to you.
Okay, I'll just make sure this shares. Okay, just a bit of a funny to start with.
I'll cut it out of the report.
So yeah, this is a report of my travels to Athens as part of the as a recipient of the Odyssey Travelling Scholarship. So I just thought I'd kick off with something I hope is amusing. Yeah, so a long journey with some adventure involved. I hope I get to convey that in this talk. So I've labelled this talk "In the Footsteps of Miltiades" as much of my time over in Athens was trying to follow the deployment of the Athenian troops to the site of Marathon and also on the plain of Marathon. Noting supervisors, Sasha is my supervisor, as is Ryan, also Karen Mickle, who's involved in sports science. So it's a bit of cross-college collaboration here. So I'm going to present some background of my research, what I undertook in Athens, and the results of 2 field surveys that I undertook while there. So my thesis is focused on the hoplite charge at the Battle of Marathon. Herodotus, a near contemporary historian writing around 30 years later, but talking to survivors of the battle, recounts various aspects which have come under intense scrutiny. So I'm keen to explore some of those in a bit more detail using modern studies. So, background to the battle, a bit of reading here. So the Persian Empire, marked in orange on the right there, extended from India to Egypt and took control of the west coast of Asia in 505. Former Greek colonies, some of which originated from Athens and Eritrea, rebelled against Persian rule between 500 and 494. They called for aid and a token force was sent from Athens and Eritrea, which was sufficiently capable militarily to advance to Sardis, shown there on the left, which was the capital of the satrap or governorship of Persia, and set fire to the hills there and some temples. They were quickly pushed out of Sardis and harried on their way back to the coast by the Persian cavalry, which basically decimated them. So it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. Seeking revenge, King Darius sent a fleet in 490 BC to capture Eritrea and an attempt to install a puppet government in Athens or burn it to the ground, like for like. His army consisted of archers, cavalry and infantry and has been variously estimated at 24,000, though the numbers tend to grow exponentially over time. His men had a reputation for invincibility. They'd not been beaten on the battlefield at this point. So this shows the the passage of the Persian fleet, first to Eritrea, which fell fairly quickly after a brief siege, and then their advance to Marathon near Athens. So on receiving news of the Persian landing, a mass levy was called, and an Athenian force of 9,000, joined by 1,000 Plataeans, marched out blocking the approaches to Athens. There's two routes that are generally considered available for this purpose. One is the inland route over Mount Pentelicus. You're looking at quite an extensive mountain range there. More arduous but shorter, and a flatter coastal route, which is shown there on the right. There's arguments to and for each of these. The coastal route was initially considered the most likely because it would block the direct line of march of the Persian army, but it would also be very vulnerable if the Persian fleet, which had deployed here on the plain, was to relocate. That's not really showing very well. They could redeploy behind them and effectively capture them on the coastal strip. These routes enter the Marathon plain from the south. The runner Phidippides was dispatched to Sparta requesting reinforcements. So the Athenians took up their positions at the Temple of Heracles. Now, efforts to locate the Temple of Heracles, which at that point, an archaic period temple. Now, the archaic period goes up to 480 BC, so that's when it becomes classical. So we're looking at archaic period archaeology primarily. So efforts to locate have been complicated by extensive reuse of the material by farmers. This is a thriving coastal plain, very heavily utilised for agriculture. So any stone that's available is quickly accommodated into a farm wall or a foundation of a building. So a lot of archaeological materials is found some distance from where it was originally laid. So Vanderpoel had suggested Valeria as the site for the temple based on a blog describing the games of Heracles. Pritchett questioned this and noted his preference for a site at Varana, which is further to the south on the plain, where temple foundations were found but never explored. And we know of various temples that were built at this location to Athena, Dionysus, and Apollo, as well as Heracles, though none of these have been positively located. Varana stands as the general consensus amongst most of the publications as the likely site. However, From Hers suggests an interesting theory which I've explored in more detail, or where it might be located. Establishing the location of the camp is important. It helps us to understand what happened next. After a 5-day stalemate, the Athenian general Miltiades, who had previously served with the Persians and knew their tactics well, received 2 pieces of information. Phidippides had returned and passed on a message that the Spartans weren't going to be there in time. And also a spy from the Persian camp revealed that the cavalry were absent. Now, this has been variously interpreted as were the cavalry loaded on ships ready to be deployed to Athens, or as Peter Krantz has suggested, that they were all foraging and just hadn't lined up in the morning. So he saw this opportunity. He knew that there was going to be no reinforcements. This is as good as it got. So in what must have been one of the most effective motivational speeches in history, he persuaded the Greeks to charge an extended distance at an enemy many thought were invincible. Herodotus tells us the Athenians charged at a run. The space between the two armies was 8 stadia, a mile, 1.6 kilometres. And the Persians thought they'd gone mad. They were the first of the Greeks we know to use the running charge against the enemies. Now, the Persians were taken aback by this, thought the Greeks were insane, and probably panicked. So with the momentum, the charge was successful, and the Persians were put to flight with many drowning in the marshes and on the beach as they tried to get back on the ships, though the majority escaped. The tally of 192 Athenian dead versus 6,400 Persians has been variously questioned. However, we do have some evidence of where the Athenians were buried. So in Athens, just want to touch briefly on various activities undertook there. Now, a big shout out to the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens. If you're ever in Athens, I encourage you to take up membership of the Institute and use their facilities. They have a hostel located very conveniently close to the metro stations and the Acropolis, as you can see there. That's a view from the balcony. Here I am at an Anzac Day ceremony put on by the Australian Embassy. Their director and assistant director assisted me in obtaining a study permit. If you want to take photos and potentially publish a site, you need a study permit. There's 18 foreign schools in Athens, and a lot of them hold talks in the evenings. So if you can get to those, you'll hear the latest researches on various activities the schools are undertaking. This one was particularly useful to me because Matthew Sears has published extensively on Greek warfare and battlefields. So I was able to have some great conversations, which I've been able to continue since. Membership of the Australian Institute also gives you readership rights to the British and American schools, libraries. In the British, which as you can see are quite comfortable places, and if you have to spend a couple of hours flying away, it's quite a pleasant atmosphere. The British school held a lot of aerial photographs that were quite useful of the plane before it was extensively developed. There were research notes at the American school of James McCready and Walter Pritchett that related to some of the sites that I was looking at. And they're quite well-funded institutions, and it's quite amazing to be looking at secondary texts on the shelf and occasionally get a 2024 publication. They've already shelved them, they're just that rapid. Obviously museums were a point of visitation. The Institute will also issue you with a card that gives you free membership to any state university. So you can visit and revisit, and I found myself going back to a couple of places several times just trying to get another view. One monument I was particularly keen on looking at, and probably looked at 3 times in the end, was the Callimachus monument in the Acropolis Museum. Now, Callimachus was the overall commander of the Athenian forces, but this was basically a ceremonial role, and he deferred to Miltiades on matters of strategy. Plutarch tells us he died in battle, pierced with so many spears that dead though he was, he stood upright. And this was on the beach as the Persians were escaping. Fairly lurid, as you'd expect from a Roman writer. A monument was erected on the Acropolis after the battle in 490. And it was topped by Iris, messenger of the gods, with the intention that Iris would send word of this great achievement to the 4 corners of the world. Though the Persians were successful in getting to Athens in 480, and it seemed they hacked it to pieces. It seems like they recognized what it stood for and sought to obliterate it. And the process of Athens being sacked in 480 sort of really did lead to a strong revival of the interest in promoting marathon amongst other Greek city-states, that Athens was great. And elements of it became more and more legendary as the historical figures faded into myth to some extent. Now, the first field survey I undertook was trying to establish, beyond the 2 routes, the inland route and the coastal route, whether there was a 3rd route from which the Athenians could have travelled to Marathon. Now, Edward Clarke was a geologist travelling through Athens in 1801, and he recounted his stories in a fairly lavish tome, which I was able to find in the British School. He documents a road, elements of a road from Stomata, which you can just see there on the left, which extended to Marathon. Josiah Ober traced some of these in 1982, shown dark darkly shaded there. So I was keen to look at these because just so I had assumed they were Hellenistic in date, which would mean that that was later than the battle. I just wanted to reconfirm this. However, was to find that this map is hopelessly wrong. The topography is incorrectly drawn and the scale is off. So it took me 3 days to find it. But I was determined. So these red arrows show different attempts on my part to locate it and sort of a little bit of the adventure. So Clarkstead Road, day 1. So I started from Stomata and followed a marked path, which was like effectively national parks path, and thought, well, this should take me somewhere. I'll see where it goes. I traced it there on the top left. It did get to Marathon, but if you look at the bottom corner of roads, there were a lot of switchbacks included, which make it impossible as being an ancient Greek road because the grade never exceeded 8 degrees for wagons. One thing I did encounter though was farm dogs, and these things are nasty. They plagued my time there whenever I was on a road or even path. I was told from the onset, always carry a stick, which is fine when there's 2 of them, but when there's 3, the third one tends to get behind you and wants to have a nip. So that photo was there where I had to run back down the road to find another stick before I could continue. So just something to keep in mind. There's something about Cerberus too, the 3 of them. The 3 makes them almost, impassable.
Did you have any biscuits?
I think they would have ripped them out of my pocket, but there's roadside chapels there which make the road quite attractive. The second time I thought I'd come from the north and there was a nice landmark there. That's a Frankish tower at Ine. And this took me through the Karadros ravine. Now this is quite a pretty place, I've got to say. I mean, when you're in the sun-drenched hills, being able to get into some shady trees is quite attractive. It's very dappled shade. You could almost imagine a satyr stepping out from behind a boulder or something. It was a really delightful spot. I did find a Greek family that was hopelessly lost, so I was able to help them out. And I did hear a couple of shotgun blasts too, because I think there's hunters that go through the woods there too, so it's always something to keep in mind. I did find it on the 3rd day, and on the left there is reproduction of Ober's 1982 publication, which I've related to a Mycenaean bridge there in the centre. There were elements of stonework that were aligned quite well, and I managed to speak to a fellow researcher who believes the road is Mycenaean, which means it was present at the time of the battle. Another hazard, I had to bush bash to get to this one, and I can tell you the undergrowth in Greece is next level spiky. The locals say it's because that's the only way the goats don't eat it, because they'll eat everything else, so it's sort of like an adaptation. But I walked into Marathon with my shirt completely torn off at one point, so people were rushing to me, "You okay? You okay?" Yeah. Which was quite nice. So where that leaves us, on the left we have the 2 paths, and I'm proposing a 3rd path there that extends to the northeast. The bridge is shown as a dot, so I was able to trace elements of that. And collectively with the suggested date of Mycenaean stonework, this aligns quite well because just to the west of Marathon is the Mycenaean palace of Aphidna, which was continued into the Archaic and Classical period settlement. So that's where Callimachus was actually from. So it's like he was marching home. And why that matters is because it puts their deployment point at a different part of the plain, and also could serve as a rallying point for the Plataeans joining them and other forces. So last thing, Marathon Plains site survey, just looking at 5 different prominent locations. The Soros down here, which is the burial mound, the trophy Placi, which was a key point of my trip, and Repki. Can you see that there? Just on the hills. And the Shinius Beach over here where the Persians Persian camp is marked. You see the Persian cavalry camp is noted as separate from the main camp. But also I want to draw attention to the deme of Marathon. Now, the deme is the settlement, the main village. You'll note the question mark there. This is a 2011 publication, so things have progressed quite a lot since then. So the Soros is a burial mound, quite distinctive. Polybius notes that it was built over where the Athenians lay, which has led to a lot of misunderstandings about the battle. Herodotus tells us most of the Greek casualties were on the beach. So it doesn't quite align, but hasn't stopped people from trying to reconstruct the battle with that as the epicenter. And this is a map from the Athens War Museum that you'll see that sort of shows the forces there all located. There's the Greek camp. That's how the battle unfolded, and doesn't really work though for a number of grounds. And we do know from other battles, Battle of Chaeronea, etc., that there's often some distance between where the bones are actually interred from where the battlefield was. And putting the mound here puts it on the main road, so it just captures people's attention. It helps with that narrative. Now, Fromherz, and I'm following his work here, has drawn attention primarily to the victory column, or the trophy that exists on the plan. That's me for scale there, just to give you an idea. Now, the trophy marked where the fighting turned and when the enemy started to retreat. So there was an Ionic column set up, and it's now in the Marathon Museum, and a replica was built for the 2004 Olympics on the same spot where that was recovered. Some research based on pottery sherds more than anything has suggested that it was surmounted by image of an Amazon and Theseus, sort of where Amazons were just symbolic of the dangerous foe from the east. Now, using the trophy as the actual frame of the battle, as the fixed point, that's the T there, allows us to some extent to try to rejig where the camp may have been. If we use Vrana as the starting point, Vrana is off here. You see that? And that was used in that previous reconstruction. That's 4 kilometers away. If we consider Repke, which I'll go into more detail, the distance is 1.8, and it's actually downhill to the trophy. So Plazi, now this was a real important part of my trip. I was able to make contact with Professor Yannis Papadodis, who's the excavation director. Now, excavations have been going there since 2012, though very little has been published on it. It's very difficult to find much. And I sort of quizzed him about that, and he noted basically it's a floodplain and there's just layers and layers of silt. There's no differentiation between the silt, so you can't use that as a dating tool. And the site is hellishly complicated because it's been built on consistently from the Mycenaean period to the late Roman. So they're very reluctant to sort of come to assumptions because the next dig season they could sort of counter their findings. So they're sitting on a lot of research, which will be really important when it does come out. But he did draw my attention to an archaic period temple shown there on the left, and a destruction layer, a layer of ash, from which he assumed was 490 BC, related to the Persian presence on the plain. Now, what he found after that period was that the site, that particular part of the site, was repurposed for domestic use. So effectively, the temple was considered contaminated and disused as a sanctuary, which is what we hear from other places where the Persians had a presence. So that sort of gives us a bit of an indication that the Persians had extended that far down the plain and taken control of the settlement. Now, Redkey, now this is the hill, which I've shown 2 different aspects of it. Now, I was working off just a footnote. There's just a footnote in a very lengthy book, lengthy study of the fortified military camps, noting that at Redkey, which is a spur of Mount Stavrokoraki, There's a well-built rubble wall. It doesn't look like the fortifications I've seen elsewhere. I suggest it may be a small temenos, a shrine, which drew my attention and prompted the question from myself and from us, was the Temple of Heracles located there? Now I've got a, not sure if this will work. So this is just a view from the top there. You're missing all the sound effects, which is the deafening wind. But it just shows the extent of the development there in the plan, and that's Mount Stavrokoraki there. And certainly up the top, yes, there are extensive walls, surrounding walls, which I did a quick survey of when I was there. Just going to turn that on. And jumped a slide. And a number of features and various bits of pottery. So I did a very quick recording report just to outline the shape and various photographs I've taken, and sent that out to every archaeologist I knew in Athens, sort of saying, can you help me? I don't normally look at this stuff. I'm Australian, we don't have this sort of stuff. And then in the last week of my stay, I finally got a response. Reinhard Senth, some of you may remember, he came out here last year as the visiting Gale professor and spoke about Olympia. He had forwarded my report on to various other researchers from the German Institute, and we got a hit, we got a result. Professor Lohmann had conducted a survey in the area in the 90s. He passed away the Christmas before. That didn't sound so good. However, he had published some of his findings, and his star pupil, Dr. Frank Jurlich, was in Athens and was able to sort of talk me through what their understanding of the site was. Now, this was really important because he had a survey permit, which meant he was collecting pottery. So the two things here, he did an outline of the site. You can see the U shape, which I sort of roughly tried to capture, and looked at the phasing based on the pottery finds he had. Dr. Papadodis from the Athens Museum, the excavation director at Plazi, was quite excited by the finds there. He hadn't been up to the hill, and he's got a lot of frustrated students working in the plant, so I'm really hopeful that he turns his attention to this site. And I left some markers up there. So he took a series of drone photos, and from these markers, he'll be able to do a 3D model, which he's got his students working on as we speak, I understand. Now, there's a particular feature in the site that Lohmann drew attention to, which I've noted in the lower corner. In the southwest, the U-shaped curtain wall overlaps the southwest corner of a rectangular building, measuring approximately 8 metres north to south and 6 metres west to east, the long side of which was oriented almost exactly north to south. So that's that area there, which, if you look at the key, is in the archaic classical period. So with this in hand, I got Frank to come to the site with me and walk me through what he knew. And we focused our attention to this southwest corner where you can see on the top left there is coursing, there are stacked blocks still. And with his eagle eyes, he was able to locate some pithoi, which are sort of like storage vases of the archaic period in close proximity to the site. So if you look at the size of that, the 8x6, it does sort of align with other known hilltop shrines. So with fairly rough reconstruction there at the bottom, which it advances the discussion suggested by Macready. He thought it was a temple based on the fact that it wasn't a fort, but he hadn't quite got to the point that there might have been a singular building there on the southwest corner, which would put it right on the peak, so the most evident from the plain as a landmark. So, yeah, so we've got none of this can be proven without an archaeological investigation, which I'm hoping the Athens University takes on. One other just curious thing that I learned, Shinias Beach there where the Persians were thought to have landed, there was the site of a major scout jamboree in 1963, which hosted 18,000 scouts. So I just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to know what the footprint of 18,000 scouts camping looked like? So I was able to sort of integrate that into sort of my understanding of the site, of the northern part of the site. And there were some Australians present there in '63, so that was. Are you related? Does it help? Yeah, could be. But yeah, they were quite forthcoming with the research. The other thing I wanted to look at, the Persians used triremes as part of their fleet, and there's a bit of an open question: how did they get horses there to the site? It's more likely than not that they used sailing vessels for the purpose. Though Thucydides, when he speaks of the Athenian campaign to Sicily, notes that some triremes were converted to transports. And whether or not they could accommodate a horse. There's been a little bit of estimation there, how big, if a horse, if you take out one of the banks of oars, like a trireme has 3 banks of oars, you take out one of the banks, how would a horse place and all that? I don't think the horse is going to be comfortable for a really long time. Voyaging and seeing a reconstruction up close, I'm even more confirmed with that idea that sailing boats for the purpose special made, much like was used at the, for the Norman crossing of the English Channel for the Battle of Hastings. That was sailing boats. While I was there, each of the foreign schools often hosts some events of an evening focused on the outcomes of some of their studies underway. The Canadian Institute one regarding Thucydides by Matthew Sears was probably the key event, though there was also elements about Minoan combat by the Netherlands Institute. At the Athens University, there was a 2-day survey workshop, which was quite useful because it showed a number of hilltop sites and spoke of issues of how sustainable was the site for the people using it. It's been suggested that, these were farmsteads that were mounted on the top of the hill, but where's the water? You've got to haul everything up there. It's not the most convenient place. Whereas a temple, a hilltop shrine, meets that requirement of visibility and is well known from the archaic period. Just to touch on a very small other aspect of my research, which enters into the sports science biomechanics realm. This was a plaque from the National Archaeological Museum I wanted to see in the flesh because it's in every publication that I come across. And that's me and some gear there. That's 28 kilos of gear if you're interested. Just doing a pilot test to demonstrate that running or jogging 1.6 Ks in the gear is eminently possible. And some of my research sort of builds on other sports sciences. The Swedish military, as basic training for their reservists, requires them within 2 weeks to be able to run 2 kilometres in full kit, which is around 20 Ks, 20 kilograms. And also there's elements that focus on heart rate, sort of level of exertion, which is best associated with the winter biathlon, where the athletes simulate running through their skiing and then have to pause and shoot with their hands shaking and all that sort of thing. So it's sort of like that heart rate transition. So if the hoplites ran a distance and then had to reassemble to engage the Persians, just that sort of process, and what do we know from sports science about the achievability of that? So that's it. If there's any questions.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ian, that was really, really interesting. Can I invite questions from the floor?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Thank you, Ian. That was really interesting. I'm glad to see that it was really fruitful and full of interesting things. I've got a question about the Persians. How homogeneous was the Persian army? Was it levied mainly in Asia Minor, or did it come from further afield, and was it divided into sort of different national groups? that Alexander was later to exploit so well, you know, dividing them up amongst each other and things like that? Or was it a main force? I know there were Athenians and Plataeans, for example, but how was the Persian army organized?
Yeah, our understanding is imperfect, though we understand that the bulk of the force, particularly the cavalry, was Persian, though they had adopted levies from Ionia. Almost as punishment, some of those colonies were forced to recruit a force to travel with them. And that seems to be where we're getting this sense of spies in the Persian camp and potential. It has been surmised that the Ionians were on the wings of the army. And if you know anything about the Battle of Marathon, it was basically an encirclement, and that the Ionians caved because they didn't necessarily have the will to fight as strongly as the Persians, or something to that effect.
Oh, thank you.
But a composite force, absolutely, and that's well described in the later Battle of Plataea and various other engagements.
I might jump in. A couple of questions about the battlefield site. Firstly, I was looking at the map centered on the Soros from the museum,
Okay.
and maybe it was just the angle of the photograph, but the gradient that seems to be shown there looks insane, right? It looks like one would possibly roll down the hill, but definitely not charge down the hill. Is it really as steep as it's?
Oh, it's a floodplain, and one thing that map shows particularly well, I think, is that the one you were referencing?
Yeah. If you look at those, I mean, those slopes just look, you know.
Oh, it's the relief. The relief is very, very prominent, but it does come from like a flat plain.
Okay.
And you can see the blue ribbon there. That's the Karadros River. So I'd been through the ravine on the other end, and that's contributed to a lot of siltation because that river has meandered. And part of the reason why Plassey was so hard to find, because it's been on maps, everyone knew it was there, but it was just under so much silt that it hadn't been picked up accurately until recently, which helps us rewrite some of the histories that were done in 2011, etc.
Okay.
But you can see there, the grade is generally flat. However, from Repke, which is the hill, you can imagine the camp on the foothills of that.
So that really gives me a sense of, seeing how steep so much of it is, it gives me a sense of why it really comes down to there's a limited number of routes that you can go through and you really have to stick to those, which then raises the question, okay, so distances and sums in ancient sources are always only indicative at best, or tend to be indicative at best. But if what one does is takes a compass and goes, well, they charged this far according to Herodotus, what sites actually end up, or what routes actually end up sensibly on that for the battlefield, for the charge point?
Effectively, Repke, or if they're stationed near the base of the hill there, that's sort of what I was getting at. It's assuming they charged and the momentum just broke the battle, and it wasn't a protracted battle because their numbers would have counted against them before they did the encirclement move. And it's presumed that the trophy marks the left flank where the encirclement first happened, and then from there the line broke and the Persians ran back to Chinias across the marsh. Now there's a fair bit of geomorphology that has to be considered here because the site has been drained extensively since the 40s, really, and just as the agriculture sort of extended further to the north. There is a national park there now, so they have sought to preserve some of the bird life and nature of what it was like, though that has to be considered, and it's a bit of an open question how far the marsh extended down. towards the centre, though it's assumed that Shinia's Beach is effectively the same configuration. Though I've seen various maps suggesting the coastline may have extended out further to the east, and that parts of Plassey therefore are underwater. You read one report, you read another report. There doesn't seem to be a lot of consistency. The coring isn't well integrated with other research, and there was quite a lot of research done in the area. Can you see that one? You see that distinct line down the middle there, that's the rowing centre that was put in for the 2004 Olympics.
Oh.
So that's a massive feature there when you walk around the plain. And there was a lot of research done on that footprint. And they did find pre-Mycenaean settlements there. So it's, you look at a lot of reconstructions and just assumes that it's devoid of occupation, but I think quite clearly it was intensively occupied with Plassey as a thriving town centre that continued into use into the late Roman.
Fantastic. I'll just go to a question in the chat, and then I think Kit's got his hand up. From Ken's on the chat, who's apologising because they're having difficulty with their Zoom, but asking where you studied your archaeology.
Sydney University, classical. So I did some field school in Portugal, looking at Celtic hill forts and survey archaeology there. That was some decades ago. Kit.
Yeah, thanks. Great. Look, given all of the movements of the river that meanders, the size of the swamp, then all of the stone robbing over the years, and then all of the building that's gone on and intensive farming there, are they still finding a lot of metal work? They're obviously, you've been talking about kind of stone work, foundations and temples on the hills and on the battle side, but is there metal work being discovered still, or has most of that now been sort of dug up?
Certainly at Plassey in controlled excavations, they're recovering quite a large amount, and unfortunately a lot of it hasn't made its way to publication yet. Certainly on the side of Repke, I've been led to believe in the unrelated to your question, but yes, there is, to answer it quickly, yes, there is stuff showing up in Plassey. And there's plenty of stuff on display in the Marathon Museum also, though a lot of it tends to be ceramic or stonework related to temples from the Roman period. But where was I going? Oh yeah, there does seem to be a lot of theft in the area. Certainly up in Repke, I'd been, from my 1965 description, I'd sort of anticipated finding certain things which just weren't there. And there were pits, there were robbing pits at various locations. So it makes it difficult to read a site when it's sort of being cherry picked. But whether or not they were using a metal detector to aid in their processes, I'm not entirely sure. But couldn't tell you what they found.
Really frustrating. Other questions?
Well, a very simple one. How long does it take the heart to come down after that level of physical activity?
Depends on fitness.
So do you think these people were pretty fit?
There's various assumptions on that. I mean, their lives were a lot more manual. Against that, hoplites tended to be more upper class. They're not farmers, for instance, they're more landlords.
Yeah, less manual.
Though there was that sort of agonistic, the sporting culture of hanging out in the gymnasium and, sort of spending a lot of time just gossiping and doing things there. So, because the important thing to remember is that the Athenian army was militia. It was just called up to serve it as needed. Generally for a campaign, it would, like there are 10 tribes. The melee effectively they would just pick particular people, but it's assumed that this was a mass levy and anyone who could be mobilised quickly was needed.
So you could have old people in the older category as well.
Yeah, well, Miltiades was about 50, anywhere between 52 and 55. So in my my study, the lab testing I'm trying to do, I'm in as much as possible, I'm trying to capture something of the physiology of the soldiers present. So that would be, so I have an upper age range of 55, lower age range of 20, and I've based it on the premise that the tallest skeleton we have today is around 177 centimeters. So you have to fit those criteria, and that works well because in terms of the replica arms and armor we have, that will fit that person, a few people shorter. But also running in sandals, which is a little bit of a different experience.
Sounds harder and harder.
I'm actually trying to make it as difficult. So 28 kilos is probably very, very high end. So I just don't want to be called out that I've made it easy, you know. So yeah, so there's elements there, and that's effectively looking at the heart rate. Now there's going to be a screening process whether people are able and if they have existing injuries and all that sort of thing. So I'm interested to see how it works. I was able to do it in a pilot test, and I'm not especially fit, so I'm hopeful.
Do we know what time of year it is when this battle?
It's variously September. Seems to land around I think September 12th is landed on as the date for the battle.
Pretty hot.
I was thinking at the end of summer, I mean, a lot of the land would have dried out, perhaps, compared with some other time of the year. When you were there, was that time?
Oh, well, yeah, I deliberately chose the colder part of the year, which it rained for exactly 10 minutes the entire time I was there. So they're going through going through a dry spell, but they were very excited. Oh, it's going to rain. Is it? Yeah, so it is very arid. I'll give you that. And Karadros at various times is like indistinct as a watercourse, except for the dry channel. They have dammed it as well, which doesn't help. But certainly there's a sense that it was marshy. There was permanent water there.
Is it kind of cooler up the hill? Is the hill big enough to be cooler than in the plain?
Certainly windy, it catches the wind, yeah, definitely. It whips through at a rate of knots. Yeah, you're struggling to stand up in some of those. Yeah.
And any further thoughts on the horses?
On how they were transported, or
about why they were not
present. I think, well, Krantz, who I find reasonably convincing, just works on the basis it was a miscalculation, that they're out foraging for too long. And the pastures around the marsh were quite limited, so it's almost single file. You have to go again along. So once they knew things were happening, they weren't able to get into the action quick enough to make a difference. It seems to be the assumption.
And then the horses would remain here. They wouldn't get. I'm just wondering if there'd be other sources of evidence. There's suddenly a lot of trade in horses, or.
Well, there was something that I was interested in, that Herodotus mentions Marathon as being famous for its horses because it's a plain and you can run them around. And whether or not that was feeding into the notion of why land there to resupply after a long campaign, because they'd been island hopping through Paros and Eritrea, they probably lost some in various locations, or maybe they're just sick, I don't know. So whether there was some assumption they might resupply there, not entirely sure. But and whatever happened to the good people of Plassey, whether they were given sufficient warning to evacuate or whether they were made into slaves like the Eritreans and stuff, we don't know. I'd like to think they got out because, what we know of the Eritreans, they were, we do have some information that they were sort of basically posted into the centre of the empire. They never made it home, a lot of those. So that was sort of punishment.
Kit, do you still have your hand up from earlier?
Yeah, I've just got a question about the previous map that we were looking at. Just what is that I think you may have mentioned it. What is that long piece of water between the Persian camp and the Persian cavalry camp?
I'll just make sure we're looking at the right thing.
It's kind of very thin oblong.
Where are we?
Was that the rowing facility?
Is that what it was for the Olympics?
Yeah, that large, that darkened line near the Persian.
Yeah, right where the marshes were.
Yeah. It was interesting that there was, like, the Ministry of Culture obviously had to approve that. Like, they have to approve all permits. Like, I'd have a study permit approved, which limited my capacity to take photos of the bridge and road because they were currently under research. But I was still able to track the alignment. That's basically what I wanted to do. And thankfully, the researcher was conducive to having a conversation to suggest that he was leaning towards Mycenaean as well, which was good. You know, it's nice to have that from a local who's looked at a lot more of these things. But the assumption was that there was some geomorphology done which suggested that the coastline was radically different, and the area taken up by the rowing facility, that the marshes were effectively an inlet. And that was considered convincing at the time that, okay, well, there's probably nil return on archaeology. It's all, you know, going to be late or disturbed or whatever. But that hasn't really necessarily borne out, because what they found there was extensive settlements, and it's a bit of a sore point that was even allowed to happen in what is such an important site for, I guess, national identity even. Like, Marathon has become a rallying cry for various things, you know, sort of democracy was saved at this place, and it's frequently cited in some of the most significant battles in history, not least because it was decisive. You know, a lot of battles, you know, it's who's left in control of the battlefield kind of thing. Okay, well, they must be the winners because the others aren't there. Whereas here it's sort of probably on the shock tactic of closing the ground, which basically eliminated the threat of the Persian archery. The cavalry weren't there to hit them in the flanks, so that they were able to just mow through lighter armed infantry that was opposed. It possibly wasn't well deployed either. So maybe they just got up an hour earlier than the other guy. When you look at a 5-day stalemate, you've got to imagine there's a bit of psychological games going on. Is today going to be the day that we do it? And I think Miltiades was made aware that, look, the Spartans aren't coming and we really needed them. So and there may well have been dissension in Athens because there was a pro-Persian party that may have been lobbying, look, why don't we just accept terms? So these things we'll never know, but I can tell you there's a ton of literature written over it, all around it. But what I was seeking to achieve in this trip was just to, I guess, frame things from an archaeological perspective, whether we could sort of advance it on the grounds of, like Fromher's had just worked off the basis of distances. He hadn't been able to establish whether there was a likely site on the hill at Repke. And Ober had, I think, misinterpreted the stonework on the road and bridge. So I think now we've been able to move a few things forward to build a different picture. I mean, it's just one of a number of potential reconstructions, but this one seems to, I don't know, offer perhaps a few different elements that haven't been seen before.
I note from your list of papers you went to that one of them was on watchdogs in classical Athenian comedy.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how those watchdogs' modern descendants stack up by comparison, given your extensive experiences at this stage.
Yeah, there were some interesting things there. It was that was actually the fellow of the Archaeological Institute of Athens for that year. So it was quite interesting. It was a very detailed conversation, but it was these were watchdogs rather than wild dogs, and made reference to Athenian comedy where it speaks about suitors visiting wives while the husbands are away, and then the husbands will go home and buy a watchdog.
Right.
Elements about Cerberus where there's at first contact with Cerberus, he's sort of fawning and sort of, you know, in interaction with Heracles and all that sort of thing. So he'll let you in, but he won't let you out.
Nice.
So yeah, it was interesting. And there was a bit of a reference to an individual who was known as an attack dog in politics, and references to Trumpism and various things like that. So yeah, covered a lot of ground. But yes, so it's definitely a lot of archaeological work being done by various institutes. The Australian institutes work in Kithra primarily, not so much on the mainland. I've remained in contact with the German Institute. If more research from Professor Lohmann becomes available, that would be fantastic. And also the University in Athens to keep gently ushering them. It might really be worth having a look up in Repke, because no one's quite got a handle on what's there, and it's a prominent site. And Lohmann speaks about finding obsidian flakes which relate to Neolithic farming implements. So it's going to have a very deep deposit when they get around to it. So we'll see what happens.
Fascinating. It sounds like an absolutely brilliant trip, and it was a really interesting paper. So please join me in thanking Ian. Just before you go, a quick note that we have an action-packed week next week with 2 presentations by AAIA Gale visiting Professor Philip Stockhammer on Monday the 5th on foods and health in Bronze Age Greece, and on Tuesday the 6th on Athenian society in the first millennium from a bioarchaeological perspective. And those 2 events, those events are in person only. They won't be recorded or online. And then on Friday the 9th of August, a friend of the seminar series, David Meredith from Oxford, will present on lost words, James Cook, Joseph Banks, John Hawkesworth, and the invasion of Australia. And that event will be in person and online. And we hope to see you then.